changes were revolutionary at the time, and they transformed the aspirations of millions of people for themselves and for their children in many nations around the world. International law itself, with the awakenings of the late 19th century and the meteoric developments of the 20th century, is a prime example of a shift in paradigm that revolutionized the scope of international obligations, adjudication, and responsibility. My own generation of international lawyers is more than familiar with the work of the visionaries who promoted the codification of international law and the founding of international intergovernmental organizations during that period. In some cases, they were the teachers of those who later, in turn, taught us. And in some cases, we felt like their grandchildren to some extent. In other cases, the connection was based on a certain degree of reverence towards the seminal texts in which they recorded their efforts to shape modern international law. The same international law that we tried to make work in the last 2 decades of the century. At the time, we had no mandate nor urgency to shift paradigms or build large international institutions, as they did. But as the first generations of jurists specifically trained in international law of human rights, we worked hard to make international protection work. And so we did, through academia, by reinforcing the teaching and understanding of human rights standards and obligations, through strategic litigation, by pushing standards of protection, from the treaty bodies themselves, through solid decision-making, and from governmental agencies devising implementation mechanisms as effectively as possible. But the era of mainstreaming international human rights as shaped, understood, and learned during the 20th century predictably evolved and met new challenges. And now we, all of us, younger and older generations together, must take responsibility for a renewed vision. So which are the challenges of the present? During the last few years, as we know, historians and political scientists have either decried international protection of human rights as not enough utopias, or declared it a hopeful endeavor, while trying to make sense of its true impact. Global activism and popular demonstrations in response to racism, exclusion, and injustice, however, have shown true engagement against systemic discrimination. On the other hand, the public reproach associated with the so-called cancel culture, or the spontaneous or planned attack or removal of historic statues or iconography, have caused a backlash in some sectors. In the postgraduate specialized classroom, skepticism regarding the impact of human rights standards and protection has grown. More voices consider that the deterioration of democracy, the disruptive use of technologies, and the unequal access to equality in education are paving the way to a less equal, fair, and peaceful societies, and a less balanced and sustainable ecosystem for our planet. Seen in context, to be fair, it is also clear that thanks to education and culture, children and youth have taken the initiative to call for meaningful climate action and have acquired or plan to acquire interdisciplinary skills to promote green economies and decarbonization with a human rights perspective. These emerging challenges and opportunities are in one way or another connected with education. There is consensus that education is still not organized in a manner that can ensure the benefit of progress for all, as indicated in the preambles of so many international instruments. And we must rethink learning and the relationships between students, teachers, knowledge, and our planet. We must now reimagine education and the right to education as a viable tool to face our fast approaching collective challenges. In a recent report, UNESCO has spoken of a new social contract for education. In UNESCO's words, this new social contract should be based on the principles of, first, access to quality education throughout life, and second, education as a public endeavor and a common good. This new vision of education should also seek to redefine learning spaces, timetables, student groupings to encourage individuals to work together. It should seek to decolonize the curricula while emphasizing ecological, intercultural, and interdisciplinary learning. It should seek to promote active citizenship and democratic participation. It should seek to recognize the importance of social and emotional learning, and it should seek to address the fears when confronting challenges such as climate change, the COVID-19 pandemic, fake news, and the digital divide. It is clear that the international law of human rights as a discipline has an important contribution to make in terms of this agenda. For our part, as active participants in the learning process, we should reflect collectively and boldly on what to continue with, what to abandon, and what to create afresh in order to reimagine education on the basis of international collaboration, teamwork, further reflection, research, and connection of natural, built, and virtual sites of learning, as proposed by UNESCO. The tools to overcome the immediate challenges and realize a vision of a better future are within grasp, and education has a fundamental role to play in strengthening our capacities for dialogue and action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Veronica. I'm now delighted to introduce our first discussant this evening. It gives me particular pleasure that our first discussant is my dear colleague, Yasin, here at the School of Law, Queen's University, Belfast. As will be known to many of our audience and indeed others further afield, Yasin is a human rights law expert. She's a scholar activist. Here at Queen's, she's also very well known for her work as co-director of the university's Gender, Justice and Society Research Network. Yasin, over to you.
Thank you, Therese, and thank you, Professor Gómez, for that enriching contribution, and it gave me so much to imagine with. And so my reflections to start off our discussion as a group are really fed by the imaginings that you offer us. And I think that is where I would like to begin. Really thinking about education and the right to education as a tool for the imagination. So where we imagine a better world, where we think about issues of justice and human rights is fundamentally where I locate our discussion of education. I have 3 brief points to my contribution on reflecting on your words. So one is, how do we imagine the role of education to be when it comes to thinking about different sources of knowledge? Knowledge in the formal sense, knowledge in the informal sense. If we begin with perhaps something that unites all of us, which is, where does a child learn about the world? Through the loving care and the education provided in the home, in the domestic setting. That is where our pathway to education begins. For those of us who are lucky to have parental figures around or be raised with community, education isn't just about a singular experience. Education is about the collective unity, the collective bond. I say this as someone who was brought up very much in an African tradition of understanding education as connecting me to my community, connecting me to those who I belong to, not only in the present, but also in the past. So when we think about the execution of the right to education, the role of formal institutions in education, we must also think about the domestic settings in which education can be fostered, can be harnessed, can be amplified, but also that relationship, that relational experience between what is the formal and the informal. And so while we have the language of human rights to push forward issues around access to education, discrimination within educational context, resourcing of education, the material, the geographical, ultimately I come back to thinking about knowledge and where we locate that in different parts of the human experience. My second point is really about thinking of the language of education. And I think I always find this fascinating because I grew up in a multilingual household, as I'm sure you did too, Professor Gómez. When you learn languages and think about the language of human rights, we must navigate that in different forms. So I remember recently I was at a conference where Quechua was being spoken and the paper was being presented, and it was phenomenal in the sense of actually placing Indigenous languages within the heart of educational systems. So what do we do to foster our diversification, our reimagining of language within the educational sphere, within the educational context? What does it bring us? And I think more importantly, how does it imagine how we can reconnect our understandings of ourselves, our community, and our planet, and everything in between? So the language of education, I think, is something I want us to reflect on, have a conversation about, and hear your perspective on. Finally, is to think about the ways in which we build and I think, as Therese said within my introduction, a feminist ethos within our educational practice. And it's a feminist ethos that I'm rooted in that is very much thinking through the ways in which erasures happen within our formal educational systems, within our language of rights. And I think this really offers us an opportunity to think about dislodging what we may know already about human rights and education and our agenda and our ambitions in that sense. But my feminist ethos demands me to call for more. So what are we missing? And perhaps what could we do differently? as Saadia Hartman often in her writing and very much influences my thinking, she asks us to think beyond the given. And in doing so, I think feminist ethos can be a way that we think differently about the world that we have been given, and in fact, the ontologies of human rights itself. So Therese, I think you gave us 5 minutes, so I will pass it on to my next panelist.
Thank you very much, Yasin. Excellent timekeeping all around this evening. It's a marvel to see. And Veronica, I'm sure you'll agree, those opening responses from Yasin, provocative and persuasive. So our second discussant this evening is Professor Gerd Ober-Leithner, who is UNESCO Chair in Human Rights and Human Security, as well as Professor of International Law and Director of the European Training and Research Centre for Human Rights and Democracy at the University of Graz in Austria. And Graz, like Pretoria, like the National University of San Martin, and like Queen's University Belfast, is part of the Global Campus of Human Rights, a network of more than 100 universities committed to educating the next generations of human rights defenders. And of course, Professor Gómez, Verónica, is the president of the Global Campus of Human Rights. So Gerd, over to you.
Thank you very much, Therese. Thank you for the invitation to this wonderful event, for giving me the chance to listen to Verónica Gómez speaking on education and human rights education, and for allowing me to engage in a debate with her and Franz and Yasin on the challenges in human rights education in terms of change as a means of reflecting on something which we otherwise do very often, sometimes also together, without really reflecting on what we do and why we do it. So I'm very pleased to be here and to share some thoughts on Veronica's lecture and then Veronica's words on the changing landscape of human rights education and the role of education. And perhaps I would like to pick up on one comment she has made on the role of education and human rights education on promoting active citizenship and democratic participation, and have a few thoughts on that in these times of uncertainty. I was happy to see that there was mention of the UNESCO activities, and I can't help saying that as a UNESCO chair, of course, the UNESCO activities in that field on the new social contract on learning. There was a sort of a precursor of that in which UNESCO also reached out to chairs and networks in asking for contributions in formulating this. And if you read the publication which emerged from that, I think much of it is focused on the importance of what UNESCO calls the cultivating of a generation of responsible global citizens at peace with itself and Earth, which is no small feat to achieve, really. And so I would like to pick on that perhaps for a moment in that postgraduate classroom that Verónica has sketched, in which we have to continue some things, abandon others, and create some things fresh. The deterioration of democracy, which has been highlighted, is certainly one of the reminders of the importance of providing this kind of education to become a responsible citizen. And only last week, a conference organized by our friends in Padova dealt with the values of the European Union and the democratic backlash in Europe, and which is well known to all of us. And of course, it seems intuitive to understand our role and the role of human rights education as a counterforce to such a deterioration of the situation, as instrumental for counteracting this kind of backlash, to counteract distorted historical narratives, to counteract legends which underpin discriminatory nationalist ideas and thoughts based on supremacy and racism at the end of the day. And that critical human rights consciousness is important for all that. And I think we would easily agree on that. The challenge perhaps is, and that would be the invitation also for a discussion, how do we deliver this? How do we create that responsible global citizen through our human rights work or through human rights education as such? If precisely that kind of human rights education that we can deliver, perhaps even at the university, is in itself often considered the kind of elitist Western project that transports values that are not in conformity with the will of the people, as the populists would have us know. And again, I'm also borrowing from last week's conference that the answer, in a way, perhaps lies in bringing human rights and human rights education down into the communities and into the cities and the places, which Eleanor Roosevelt in 1948 reminded us that we need to bring the Universal Declaration of Human Rights home. So we might also want to bring human rights education home. And a response given in the conference I've just mentioned was also to highlight the importance of cities, communities, mayors, regions, which understand them as human rights defenders, providing a counterweight to nationalist tendencies. And if that is the case, if the promotion of a human rights culture within localities, within local public services, within local communities is important, then how do we need to think afresh of providing that kind of human rights education, human rights training in these fields, in these areas? A second point I think I would like to make when it comes to the responsible human citizen, that's a responsible global citizen working in line with human rights, is to mention the pandemic as the great disruptor that it is in many fields. And again, I think while we agree that human rights education provides an understanding of the rights, is it not also the role of a responsible citizen to understand the linkages between individual rights, between the public good, and between collective duties? That is, understanding human rights in context. And this is something I think very often is disturbing to watch, that this is not the case. Let me give you a simple example. In my country, Austria, a small single issue party has recently formed itself, which essentially got 6% of the local election and essentially has one agenda, which is anti-vaccination with an anti-scientific bias. And interestingly, the party calls itself the Party of Freedom and Fundamental Rights. I don't think they read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I don't think they understand human rights in context. How can we make sure that we deliver that context in the different and difficult times that we face? And last point, perhaps also related to this, the strong anti-scientific bias that we witness in many places is also a counterweight or an issue that we need to discuss when we want to consider human rights education as an academic exercise driven and based on science. Can human rights education have a role to play in reclaiming also the role of science, scientific research, scientific facts as the precondition to become a responsible global citizen? The Committee on Economic and Social Rights has just last year adopted its General Comment number 25, in which it highlighted that benefiting from scientific progress is a human right. Why is it so difficult to understand that benefiting from scientific progress, including in the medical field, is actually a human right? And how can we use that as a counterforce for a current trend, which is so much about neglecting and downgrading and ridiculing scientific research and resorting to alternative facts and fake news in the times that we are living in? And do we have a role in the human rights education field to reflect on that? I think I've also reached my 5 minutes, and I perhaps leave it with these thoughts on something that I found very important in Veronica's speech on the question of democratic participation, active citizenship, and whether human rights education is about more than human rights, is about creating the responsible global citizen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gerd, Professor Ober-Leithner. Always like it when something ends with a question, particularly when it's a vitally important question. We turn now to our third and final discussant this evening. I'm delighted to welcome again Professor Frans Viljoen, who is Professor of Law and Director of the Centre for Human Rights in the Faculty of Law at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. Frans is the founding editor of the African Human Rights Journal. Earlier this year, Franz was elected a member of the Advisory Committee of the United Nations Human Rights Council. Franz, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you so very much, Therese, and thank you very much also for the opportunity to be part of this event. Wonderful. I think, Veronica, you have given us much to reflect upon, and I take this phrase that you use the idea of the collective vision that we also have as a global campus. So let me first relate my remarks to the global campus that really brings us all together, as Therese also pointed out. Now, I think what binds us together is that we espouse and we try to inculcate a set of values, universally, globally agreed terms that we find, for example, in the Universal Declaration. And in a sense, that is what the Human Rights Project does. It tries to find these minimum core values upon which we agree, and then we build on those. But we are a global campus with regional hubs, with differences. We live in very different parts of the world where our experiences are very different. And that is certainly true for the human rights movement as a whole, that it has these common values, but it has these localities within which these values are made to be lived realities. I think my interest is, among others, to look at how do we face this challenge of, if you like, balancing the global aspiration with the very different, sometimes, realities of the locality, of the locale. So if we look at the African context, I think, and any other context, as a matter of fact, I think the way in which perhaps we can think about human rights education, international human rights, is to ask how does the global, the universal, become responsive to the social context? Because I think the problems around legitimacy that Gerd also described, really part of the response is in making these universal global rights locally responsive. And just, you mentioned the Anthropocene, you mentioned climate change, and I think from an African perspective, for example, an example of how we would deal with a universally important aspect would be to say, but how do we now deal with what is increasingly being referred to as climate change apartheid? How is it that those who are already the most poor and live in the most difficult conditions would suffer the brunt of what we are now finding climate change would bring, whereas the countries in which they live have contributed the least to what really underlies climate change? So perhaps we need to interrogate, in our context, what does the concept refugee entail? How does a climate refugee become defined? Does it mean that we have to radically reconfigure our notions of citizenship and even of nationhood? Can we think of nations and citizenship in the same way if the very borders that we have set up in these territories are overrun by the forces of nature? How do we think radically and conceptually different about these things? The second is, perhaps you referred also to the new industrial revolution, technology, rapidly expanding innovative technology, artificial intelligence. In Africa, again, for example, we are a site not of the development, but of the consumption of these radical innovations. So the anxiety on my part is, in a sense, that the excitement of the new can so easily lead to an uncritical buy-in, reliance and application of what the new technology brings. What does it mean? I would say is a crucial question for us going forward. What does a human rights-based approach mean when it comes to technology? How do we now look at reaping the benefits, but at the same time retaining the focus on the human, on human relationships and our own survival? I think another way in which, again, the universal concerns become refracted in the locale would be around issues of the role and the responsibilities of non-state actors. I think this is, again, one of the pivotal points going forward. In Africa, for example, we've seen vast involvements of private actors in the provision of social services. Obviously, there is a place, But if your educational systems, if your healthcare, if your water and so on become essentially provided by private actors, how does that affect the role of the state if multinationals really and other corporates take these very basic services in hand? And how does that, again, lead to a different thinking about who are the entities that ultimately are the duty bearers, and how can we, in our human rights understanding, stick to the idea that the state principally is the duty bearer if non-state actors have such power to wield. Let me briefly then just also attach myself to what Yasin had said about sources of knowledge. I think you've mentioned, in a sense, the idea of decolonizing knowledge. You also talked about the central text. And I think what we also need to increasingly think about is how we decenter that which we teach. How do we make this academically marginalized, knowledge sources more integral to how we teach? I have attended a webinar the other day around also knowledge that we rely on as scholars, and scholars who now produce the education. And I have since then almost gone into an impasse, because I've started to look at all the footnotes in all my articles, and I asked myself, how come I refer to these and these and these particular authors? And I realized that there are others, a multiplicity of sources in which we as academics, as the scholars who direct education, what do we rely on? What are the sources that we find our anchors in, and on which we base our knowledge accumulation? And I think it relates to also what Yasin said about language. I just want to make the point that I find that very interesting, but perhaps also to talk about diversity in different ways. How do we inscribe diversity in the classroom? Because it's not only what we teach, but how we teach it. And in our experience in the master's program in Africa, we found it very useful to, for example, when it was very difficult to talk about what we call sexual gender minorities, lesbian, gay, transgender persons' rights, one of the options was to actually have a scholarship directed and specifically targeting people from those sexual gender minority communities, bring them into the classroom so that the language, the issues we address within those classrooms can never be the same, because it's not an external but an integrated discussion. And the same applies to, I think, persons with disabilities. Having a person with a visual impairment, hearing impairment, it is amazing. We've seen this happen, I'm sure others have. How does those differences, which are inscribed in the physicality of that locale, of that physical space, how that is transformative and also increases our way of dealing with international human rights law in a way that resonates ultimately, in a way that addresses the legitimacy concerns that we experience now. Thank you very much. I'm not even sure how many minutes that was, but thank you so much for the opportunity, Therese.
Thank you, Franz. An absolutely fascinating set of questions. I could see Veronica nodding and taking notes. So many provocative questions. My own favorite was, how do we inscribe diversity in the classroom? But it was hard to choose a favorite from amongst the wonderful list of questions. Veronica, Professor Gómez, how would you like to proceed? Would you like to respond to anything that's being raised by our discussants at this point, or would you prefer to go straight to Q&A from our audience, from the chat function?
If I have 2 or 3 minutes, just to, because there are wonderful ideas here, I think we are in the same page. Here, we have different nationalities and some generational differences, and so it would be great to integrate the Q&A. But here, there's some really, really important concepts. Very quickly, the first, knowledge as part of human experience. I don't like speaking too much in the first person. That's why I try to resist the temptation to go into there in the brief lecture. But absolutely, this is essential. knowledge as a human experience and its connection with language, the language of human rights. Jasim took me right to a practice in the Inter-American system that I think should be present more frequently, which is using radio to read human rights reports in non-official languages of international organizations. This is something, for instance, that was done in Haiti, because there's no point in printing a report in English and Spanish, even in French in some cases, and having it on a shelf. How do we get these concepts, these ideas, these standards to citizens, to contribute to what Gerd was pointing at, the responsible human rights citizen, but not the privileged one that can access to a certain stage of education. How do we get close to what Franz was talking about, which is, and also Gerd, the local dimension of human rights, the first line of connection with the population. So, this practice, and this is something that I spoke a lot during my campaign for judge at the Inter-American Court. How do we revisit some practices that were used during the 20th century and that now, because we rely on fast technology, maybe we use less, but reaching different areas of the population by tapping into local languages and using resources as simple as a radio that simply works with some batteries and is accessible to different populations around the world. Very simple technology, aside from the other options that we have with more modern technologies. I think this is essential. Then Jasin also talked about the feminine ethos, which is really important, and for all of us, I think, is deeply associated with the idea of education, because education starts with a relationship of, with our mothers when we come out of the womb. This is a very, very essential link, and for many of us, not only in the 21st century, not only in the 20th century, but also in the 19th century, the educators historically have been women. And it's been a long way until women could be integrated into university as educators, but law was actually one of the first disciplines in which women were welcome and they were part of in many areas of the world, including my own country. Even when I studied 35 years ago, there were more women studying law than men. And eventually that permeated the presence of women in university education. But I have to say, I'm the first woman to be proposed by my country to the Inter-American Court, in 30 years. So, this also tells us about the position of women. So I'm very sensitive also to the feminist ethos idea. Responsible human rights citizenship, local citizenship, global citizenship, essential for the immediate challenges that we have today. We're watching the news all over the world. We know what is going on with the pandemic as the big disruptor. And we're having elections in different parts of the world, last one in Chile, where we see this language here in Latin America is called libertarian tendencies, where there is a claiming of the idea of the defense of rights and freedoms mixed with misinformation. So I think this is one of the big challenges. How do we reconnect? All of the elements, responsive citizenship, defense of democracy and fundamental rights, and something that Gerd brought, which is also the relationship with science, an area that very dear to Therese and I, to our hearts, and that we're working on precisely with UNESCO to connect human rights and science. There's a lot of work to be done in this respect. And this also connects me to something that, that Franz was talking about, which is the role of states and other actors, because there are other actors that are responsible for the production of science and patents. Patents are so important for vaccinations, for other medications. And this defense of social economic rights, this connection with private actors, in many cases more powerful in economic terms than many states of other states of the international community. These are new topics that we need to address, that they're in their infancy, within the topic of business and human rights. This is one of the big tasks in terms of shifting paradigms that we have in front of us, rethinking sovereignty, rethinking states, rethinking subjects of international law. And your concept, Franz, about also rethinking the idea of human mobility vis-a-vis climate change is also at the center of the issues that we need to rethink and address. So all of these issues connected with sovereignty, with borders, with responsibility, are very much in this very challenging agenda that we have as international lawyers. I'm also very sensitive to the issue of the academic trap, that sometimes what was a unifying, what was this glue at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, that is those that promoted international law, had a language in common, and that help us in a way speak the same language at the moment in which we were codifying international law and creating the big international institutions that we know today, in a way has limited the language, the authorities that we tend to rely on, and that in a way academia also expects us to rely on. And this diversification in the classroom also needs to connect with the diversification in the sources of authority and the points of view that we take into account. I think that there is a role there for associations like the Global Campus of Human Rights, but there is a lot of work to be done, not to be trapped in the jargon, in the close society of the comfort of the sources and authorities. In a way, to me, is very much like the world of the 19th century, when we really have to step into the world of the 21st century as UNESCO is inviting us.
Thank you, Professor Gómez. Let me now invite our two graduate students who've been engaging with the chat function. That's Thomas Stewart, welcome Thomas, and also Gift Sotonia Frank, to turn on their cameras and join us and get ready to let us know about some of the interesting questions and issues that have been cropping up in the chat function. But before handing over to the two of you, Gift and Thomas, let me just say for my own part in relation to Veronica's response to the discussants, as I listened to Veronica and the clarity and cogency, if I may say, of her response to the three discussants, I was struck again by how fortunate the Global Campus of Human Rights is to have her leadership as our president, and that although I have having been a law academic for 30 years, read a great many judgments already in my career, I am very definitely looking forward to reading the judgments that will be handed down by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights when Verónica joins it. So on that note, let me hand over to the two of you, Gerd and Thomas, who has got a first question to put to Professor Gómez and our discussants.
I'm really honoured to have been asked to assist this evening, and thank you very much, Professor Gómez, for your contribution and all of our distinguished discussants. There are a couple of questions in the chat here about legal education, human rights education, and I wonder if, Professor Gómez, you might start us. This question pertains to the relative rigidness or the perceived rigidness that this questioner sees in academia. And she wonders whether you feel that there is sufficient flexibility built into that system to allow us to adapt to the new times that are upon us. And I know that you've studied on this continent in South America. I wonder if you have any perspectives on how those systems differ and how adaptable each of them is.
Yes, if I can answer directly, yes, I think that, you know, Gerd Ober-Leithner, Franz William, that we're the same age. And I don't know how they felt, you know, coming from different continents. Franz from Africa, I'm from Latin America, I'm from Argentina. And when I studied, I was very honest when I was saying I do feel as the first generation who was actually instructed in international law of human rights. There was a big debate with the Ministry of Education and the University of Buenos Aires, that is my alma mater, you know, for the degrees of lawyer and also public translator that I am. And there was a big debate on whether human rights education should be part of the curriculum. Talking about year 1985. Okay, most law schools didn't include it in the curriculum. And so the motion to include it won, because we were coming from a transitional justice period, you know, from a dictatorship, and it was very clear that we needed to do this. But there was no postgraduate education. This was at the graduate level. And my generation had to go abroad to get an education. People used to go to the US or to Europe, to different countries in Europe or to the US. We didn't have usually the resources to do it on our own. You know, in Argentina, university education is free. And it's a factor of social mobility. So most students don't come, you tend to come from, you know, low middle class or middle class families without the resources to support somebody studying in the US or in Europe. So we usually went out thanks to scholarships, to international cooperation. So that's why I'm a firm believer in international cooperation, because I know how it helped my generation to be able to pursue a more rounded human rights education. Now, we were absolutely clear that this was a perspective from the North. We knew that if we're going to the US, we're going to get certain perspectives. People in the US that did human rights, they were looking at Latin America and what was going on. And so it was an outside job, you know, something that you did to help somebody in another country at the time, in the 80s. And in Europe, it would be a slightly different perspective. But again, it would be a perspective from the North. It would not be our own perspective. I was very lucky to bring the topic of the inter-American system to my studies in the United Kingdom. And they tried to embrace and guide me in my perspectives. But after I left Nottingham and I worked at the Organization of American States, I joined this project that we share with Gerd, with Franz, with Therese, on human rights education in different regions of the world. So I returned, and now there are many, not only the one I direct, many programs on human rights education in Latin America and the Caribbean. There is a proliferation of those. And the idea of decolonization and human rights education, as mentioned by UNESCO, also Yasin mentioned this. This is very much part of the human rights education that is offered today around the world. And it is possible, and we try at the Global Campus of Human Rights to marry those local and regional perspectives with a more global perspective. Really to also continue working on the idea of the universality of human rights. I mean, France, who's devoted his entire life to human rights in Africa, is a firm believer also about the universality of human rights. So we really support the idea of human rights at the local level, like Gerd was talking about. Also, we really support regional perspectives because the good neighbor situation is really important for the protection of human rights, but keeping alive the idea of the universality of human rights is essential. And it's at the core of our mission as well. This local and this global dimension of human rights. I think I'm sure the other discussants have also a lot to contribute about this.
Thank you for your response. I suppose Professor Teres put a few thoughts in the chat box, but before we pick on a few, I just wanted to ask one question. You talk about the fact that some of the practices of taking the local and the universal and promoting the universal, human rights as a universal, is already being done. Do you have examples of where this is really, like examples of where it's effectively being done, like maybe examples of how this has been done, particular examples to just sort of help us wrap our heads around how it actually looks like in practice?
Well, the thing is, I come from a region where there is little, let's say, there's little conflict about that. Why? I'm sorry that I'm obsessed with the history of international law, but when states really got together to promote international law at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, it was mostly small states of the international community that wanted this concept and this idea to succeed, because that brought with it the notion that sovereign states were equal. And it pushed the idea that states could not use force against each other in their mutual relations. I know it sounds like a very simple idea, but it's the difference between having an international community that trades in violence and war and making war illegal. It's that difference. And they were really pushing for it. They were really, really pushing for it. So the states, at least the Latin American states where I come from, were, they were natural internationalists. They were natural internationalists. And they created the first international organization that today we know as Organization of American States, but it had a different name at the beginning, but it's actually created in 1889. It was the very first international organization. And so from the beginning, they were working on having a human rights declaration, and they were amongst the founding members of the United Nations. Of the 50 member states, that founding member states of the United Nations, 20 were from Latin America. So many of the ideas infused in the Charter come from my part of the world. So to me, it's there is no difference. So the mention of human rights as principles of the UN are there because these states were pushing for that idea. The notion of equality and right to justice are included in the Universal Declaration because those states pushed for that idea. It was resisted. the rest of the states of the international community resisted the idea of including the right to equality in the Universal Declaration. It's documented, okay? And it took a big push from Latin American states and the drafts of Panama and Chile of for the final text of the Universal Declaration to succeed, as used as foundation to include these rights. Many things that we take for granted, they actually came from peripheral parts of the world because it was part of their agenda. So sometimes this doesn't apply to all regions of the world. We know that. But many times we feel that it's an effort for the periphery to partake in some of the most basic principles of human rights. And actually, they were there in their inception because it was in their own interest for those to be crystallized in international law at that moment in time. But that was that moment when, Latin American states were young, they had emancipated like 70 years ago, the constitutions were fresh, they were trying to make the democracies work. This is a different scenario. Our beginning of 21st century is a different scenario. So who are the new actors? National states are clearly debilitated. So who are the stakeholders in this moment of change, in this moment for a new paradigm? I think that we all have to be protagonists, even children. They want to be protagonists and they will be. So it's a new world. So we have to take this opportunity.
Thank you so much. I suppose the next question here, which ties into what you have just been talking about, is one that Professor Terez asked, but I guess, Yasin, it might be for you to answer. Think beyond the given. And I'm asking this question where she says, how do we do this as reimagining teaching international human rights? Do you want to answer that question? And also tying it to what Professor Gerd Ober-Leithner said about how do we deliver on this? So over to you to just answer a few questions. Thank you.
Yeah, would you answer?
Dr. Yasin Bronger and perhaps Professor Frank and Professor Ober-Leithner. Good. Thank you. Dr. Bronger, you go first if you don't mind.
Okay, yeah. So in terms of that, I think it ties in to part of the conversation that we've been listening to now about the universal. I think in thinking beyond the given and my own experience of a more radical pedagogy to reflect human rights practice is exactly what Professor Gómez is saying, is to recenter what we think of as the margins, right, and the periphery, and to bring that into the classroom, right? So when it comes to who are you reading, why are you reading them, the languages in which one engages with the materials. So even a basic thing about having predominantly, let's call global North scholars in reflecting issues that are deeply embedded in consequences located within the global South. So dislodging ourselves from a practice that we may be conditioned into doing and thinking. That's what I sort of mean in terms of Saidiya Hartman's point about thinking beyond the given. But that also means breaking the boundaries of law, right? So Professor Gómez there talks about, being interested in the history of international law. And I think we all have to be interested in different subjects that speak to the same issues within human rights, right? So it is not monopolized through the discipline of law, and it is our undisciplining, right? It is to unshackle our discussions of human rights away from the lens of law, to look at history, to look at literature, to look at music, to look at art, and then to incorporate that to create this language and discussion and discourses within our classrooms, right? So one can read a case, but also one can look at artwork and street art in Latin America when it comes to thinking about feminist movements or gendered issues in human rights, right? So there's ways in which we can actively change the dynamics of the classroom. And Franz gave us, phenomenal examples of that in terms of who also is in the classroom and how we uplift and position ourselves as educators at the front, but alongside our students in creating an environment where we are constantly learning. So it isn't just about entering the classroom to take in knowledge, but to also be agents and constructs of that knowledge itself. And I think that's what the Global Campus of Human Rights is doing, right, in changing that fundamental dynamics in the classroom. So those are just examples of ways to, again, think beyond the given.
Thank you, Yasin. It pains me to suggest that we have to close down this conversation shortly, but we will have to do that. However, let me turn very briefly to both Gerd and Franz to see if they have any comment they would like to make on this question, or indeed any other issue that's come up, and then I'll hand over to Veronica for the closing comment. Gerd, would you like to say anything at this point?
Just a very brief comment, perhaps, because there is a common trend emerging in this debate, which is that the focus that we had on the nation state and the government and the centrality is waning, and not so much as sort of a deliberate attempt or a big doctrinal shift. It's a very pragmatic change that we look to that diversification of protagonists and actors that Veronica and others have referred to, in simply looking elsewhere, and that's also the response to how do we deliver, to look elsewhere in communities and places where we can deliver. Human rights cities are one of the examples in which you have this kind of attitude. The youth and the children have been mentioned. We still have not managed really to understand how their participation can meaningfully happen. So I think this diversification of protagonists in a pragmatic way is perhaps part of the answer.
Franz, over to you.
Yes, maybe back to beyond the what we teach, beyond the how we teach, to the institutional setting in which we teach. I think it's often being referred to as the hidden curriculum. What do we signal by the buildings, the artwork, the symbols, the narratives that surround the defining of what it makes to be a student? All of that, I think, impacts so pervasively on the messages, the way in which we approach or any teaching, but in particular, I think our teaching around international or national human rights. So I would advocate for, very critical reflection about these institutional cultures in which we find ourselves reified, as they are often, and to also critically escape and take our message together with us out of that sometimes trap in which we find ourselves. Thanks.
Thank you, Franz. And Veronica, last but not least, a closing remark from you.
Very shortly, I love the notion of hidden curriculum. Yeah, it's true. Just to say that because we've talked about diversifying, and listening and including, but also to acknowledge, the role that the academia in Europe and also in the United States have had, to develop these topics. This is very important, and there is no hidden agenda there. It's simply that it's a longer term investment in education that has allowed educational institutions in the North to have full-time professors and to have more academic development and more opportunities for academia, which we don't find in other parts of the world necessarily. They're more scarce because academia is built in a different way in order to be more inclusive, but that means that it's less efficient in producing PhD graduates and full-time professors, because that requires a big social and economic investment that is lacking in other parts of the world. So I think that we've made important efforts to integrate, to collaborate with each other, efforts of which we are very proud in the North and in the South, very, very East and West, very, very proud. But we're going to have to find new ways for the benefit of all, new ways of collaborating, rethinking, not simply doing more of the same. So this is my final message. Thank you very much. It was an incredible experience, and I feel very honored to have spent this afternoon with you.
Thank you very much, Veronica, Professor Gómez. Thank you, Franz, Professor Filion. Thank you, Gerd, Professor Ober-Leithner. Thank you, Yasin, Dr. Brunger. And thank you also to our graduate students, Thomas Stewart and Gift Satonia Frank. In closing, it strikes me that if Stephen could have been here with us this evening, Stephen Livingstone, in whose honour this lecture has been created, he would have been so thrilled. He would have been thrilled about the student participants. He would have been thrilled by the existence and growth of the Global Campus of Human Rights. And Veronica, I think in particular, he would have been thrilled to see one of his former students as president of the Global Campus of Human Rights and judge-elect of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. We look forward, as I said earlier, to seeing what you achieve over the coming years. We know you'll achieve a great deal and help us, in Yasin's words, quoting someone else, to help us think beyond. On that note, let me thank all of our audience for joining us and wish you well, whatever time zone in the world you happen to be in. Wish you well for the rest of your day or your evening or your night or your morning. We'll be doing a write-up of this on the Queen's University Belfast News, and I'm glad it's not me doing the write-up, because I would struggle to be concise in my response to the richness of this evening's lecture. Professor Gómez, thank you again on behalf of all of us. Thank you.